I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar from the American Nuclear Society's Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee. My name is Prasad Kadambi and I'm chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about from purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPB approaches. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act recognized RIPB and it has now become part of the statute, you might say. There's a lot of guidance available on RIPB approaches, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with the guidance because the conventional approaches still dominate most things we do, including standards development. Right now, I would say that ANS can be considered as a knowledge center for RIPB approaches and methods. RP3C initiated these community of practice webinars on RIPB to enable practitioners of RIPB approaches to share their knowledge and experience. We have scheduled these webinars for the last Friday of every month. I'm particularly pleased to welcome today's presenter, Tom King, because the subject he's going to cover is something that has been very important to me for the last 20 odd years. It's the white paper on risk-informed and performance-based methods that the Commission issued in March of 1999. This has been really the central document around which what we are trying to do in RP3C for ANS standards, what we use as the sort of guidance that is very important. So anyway, I'd like to have Tom King introduce himself and also the subject of today's talk. Tom, please take it away.
All right, thanks, Prasad. Yeah, I had worked for NRC for 20 years, and I left NRC in 2002. I've been doing consulting work for various organizations since then. But while at NRC, got involved with risk-informed performance-based regulation. And what I want to talk about today is, from my perspective, where did I see a big shift from the traditional way of doing things to a performance way of doing things? And I'll give a little history and then a little status of what's going on today. You know, performance-based regulation is a term that's been around a long time. But, you know, what does it mean? How to get started and what's currently underway now? Pat, if I could have slide 2. As Prasad said, there may be some misunderstandings on what's meant by performance-based regulation or just some lack of knowledge. But in a simplified fashion, performance-based regulation is regulations or regulatory activities that are based on measurable or calculable parameters. And they can be parameters, the traditional, temperature, pressure, dose, flow rate, so forth. Acceptance criteria are based on the measurable or calculable parameters. And in doing that, it gives flexibility to the designer and how to meet the criteria. There's no there's no prescriptive requirements in a performance-based regulation specifying certain pieces of equipment, for example. And basically it focuses on the outcome, and it puts more responsibility on licensees with respect to how they operate and maintain their plants and how they need to improve programs if necessary to meet the acceptance criteria. Important aspect in setting acceptance criteria is you need to have sufficient margin needs to be provided in the acceptance criteria to avoid an immediate safety concern and to allow for corrective action. And the margin can be in traditional terms like temperature or pressure to stay, set your acceptance criteria below what would actually represent a safety hazard. And it can be with respect to time. If you have a lot of time to take action, you can factor that into where you set your acceptance criteria. And the acceptance criteria can be at the plant level, system level, or component level. Next slide, Pat. Now, a little trip down memory lane here. I joined the NRC in 1982. Regulation was done in a conventional fashion. Performance was calculated in the design phase and compared to acceptance criteria, either in the regulations or in codes and standards. And in the operations phase, performance was evaluated in a qualitative fashion. In 1977, the NRC introduced the systematic evaluation program, which looked at specific topics and evaluated all plants against those topics. Again, it was a qualitative assessment using operating experience and judgment. 1984, the Commission issued a policy, what they called the Integrated Safety Assessment Program. Again, it was a qualitative approach, but the big difference between that and the systematic evaluation program was now each plant had factors that it was evaluated against that were unique to that plant. In other words, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all evaluation program. That eventually got renamed to the Systematic Assessment of Licensee Performance, or SALP program. And also back then, NRC did extensive evaluation of operating data and major operating events. In fact, they had a whole division in NRR devoted to that. It's called an Analysis and Evaluation of Operating Data, or AEOD. That doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, it served an important purpose, particularly in providing information to evaluate plants. But in evaluating this data, they were really looking at performance, but looking in a backward fashion. The data had already been generated. Now they could look at trends, they could look for recurring problems, but it wasn't looking at performance in a real-time fashion. Next slide, Pat. Now, in the mid-90s, I saw interest in performance-based regulation really jump to a much higher level, and this was under Chairman Shirley Jackson's tenure. As Prasad mentioned, there was a commission white paper issued in March of 1999 that talked about risk-informed performance-based regulation, and its main purpose was to describe the various terms: risk-informed, risk-based, performance-based, so forth, so that there was a common understanding of the terminology. But in preparation of that paper and issuing that paper led to a number of initiatives. Now, the one that stands out in my mind is the maintenance rule. When the commission decided they want to wanted a maintenance rule, and I think that was under Chairman Carr. I was a branch chief, and that assignment happened to end up in my branch. So what we did initially was develop a prescriptive approach for the maintenance rule. We talked to other organizations, we talked to FAA, to the airline industry, to the Navy, and tried to identify what makes up a good maintenance program. And basically came down to three basic areas. There's a preventive, predictive, and corrective maintenance. And under each of those, there's certain elements that need to be in a good maintenance program. So we issued the proposed rule, got a lot of comments back on it, but it still stayed a prescriptive rule. And then we went forward with the final rule and sent that up to the commission, and they bounced it back. They said, no, here's an opportunity to go in a performance-based fashion. And as I remember, it was Commissioner Asselstein who was really the driving force behind that. So we put together a task group to decide, and it involved some of the commissioners' technical assistants, how to rewrite this rule in a performance-based fashion. And what came out was the current 5065 rule that's in Part 50. That came out in July of 1996. Now that was, I think, an eye-opener for a lot of people. They started to think about how else could we do something like that. And that led to rethinking the reactor oversight program to get away from a judgment, qualitative assessment to something that's based more on real data and real-time data. So that was started by looking at the results from the IPE program, identify the most risk significant systems, events, etc., and to come up with a set of factors that could be were generally applicable across the industry to the LWRs and things that the reactor oversight program should focus on. Brookhaven did a lot of that work. They issued a new Reg CR 5392 that documented that. And the parameters were selected, monitor these factors that were risk significant, and they were called performance indicators. And today there's 17 of those performance indicators that are applied to each of the plants. You can go online and find all the plants and their rankings against those 17 indicators. And they cover, a number of areas. They cover unplanned events, mitigating system performance, barrier integrity, emergency planning, and so forth. The next slide. The recent activities. Well, in the late 90s, their performance-based approach was added to 10 CFR 5048, and a new Reg 1521 was issued that talked about risk-informed performance-based methods for fire protection analysis. So that was another significant step forward. And in 2018, the Commission approved functional containment performance criteria. That was an initiative that basically put the burden on the applicant to identify what system structures and components were important for mitigating the release of radionuclides, and they required them to do it by event category. Well, what's important for AOOs, for design basis events, for beyond design basis events, and then to roll those, the important characteristics of those components together, so that, because some of the components are important beyond design basis events as well as design basis events. And then they came up with a set of criteria that those components, performance criteria that those components would have to meet to be able to say that I have a functional containment. Now there's a proposed rule for emergency planning that's out now that is based on a performance-based approach. It requires licensees or applicants to come in and identify how are they going to measure the performance of the emergency planning program. Then they can decide if they want to monitor drills and exercises and measure the timing and count the mistakes. Do they want to look at equipment operability? Do they want to look at their communication systems? Whatever it may be that they feel they need to look at to show that they have an effective emergency planning. Now that comment period on that rule is expired. I'm not sure when it's going to be turned into a final rule, but along with that rule, the staff developed the draft reg guide 1550. It gets into more detail about how to do a performance-based emergency preparedness program. And that the number on the slide says DG 1350, but if you go to find that in the NRC website, it's under Reg Guide 1.242. You won't find Draft Guide 1350 anymore. Now, currently, there's a lot of work going on to prepare for the licensing of small modular reactors and non-LWR reactors. NRC issued a Reg Guide 1.233, endorsing an industry proposed initiative called the Licensing Modernization Project. It takes a risk-informed, performance-based approach for future reactor licensing. Now, there's also, going along with that, there's a rulemaking initiative called Part 53 to develop a risk-informed, performance-based rule for future plant licensing. The voluntary applicants could choose to be licensed under that new rule, Part 53, or they could stick with the old Part 5052. But the idea is to not be so prescriptive and to allow performance. Performance is calculated through PRA calculations to determine what are the licensing basis events and what are the system structures and components that the design needs to meet the safety criteria. Now, as part of developing guidance as to how you would review an application following that route, we've tried to put in some performance-based thoughts into those things. And the two that are out for comment now are review guidance associated with operational exposure and effluent monitoring, where we basically said, if you want to take a performance-based approach, you can commit to do that and talk about how you would do that. And then that's approved, you would not need to put as much design information in the safety analysis report. Now, there's probably many other places that that approach could be taken. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Now, one of the things that has happened in the feedback we've gotten from industry, from NEI, is they've proposed some areas where a performance-based approach to these future programs could be taken. And they recently gave us some suggestions on that. And we're looking at those, see how else we could factor in, and where else we should factor in performance-based approaches. Next slide. Okay, so my impression is performance-based approaches have been and are continuing to be considered in regulatory activities. It's not something that's been swept under the rug. Again, they put the burden on the applicant or licensee, propose the goals, and define how they're going to monitor those goals and what the acceptance criteria should be. And with that, they get more flexibility, but they also get more responsibility. And performance-based approaches do have the potential to reduce the amount of design and programmatic information that goes into an application. So that's something that we've gotten feedback from industry on, and is being talked about as part of the work to develop the guidance for these various activities. But I'll close by saying, feedback on any areas that you think are candidates for a performance-based approach are welcome, because sometimes it's hard to make that jump from the traditional way of doing things to totally rethinking how to do it. And I know we're trying to do it in supporting NRC, and NRC is trying to do it, but other people on the outside have different perspective and can probably give us some useful feedback. So with that, I'll turn it back to Prasad, and if there's questions, we can answer those.
Thank you very much, Tom. The one thing I didn't mention and you didn't bring it up is that you were the primary author for that white paper, right, Tom? This is the SRM to SECI 98-144. And I think you interacted directly with the commission. Perhaps you can just spend a minute or so talking about how, that interaction produced the white paper, which I still think is quite radical in some of the things that it brings up.
Yeah, well, again, Shirley Jackson was the driver behind this, and she asked that a paper be prepared that would define these various terms and promote the use of risk-informed performance-based regulation. And in preparing the draft SECI paper, he had gone up and talked to her staff before we actually had the EDO sign the SECI paper. And a gentleman by the name of Jim Johnson was on our staff. He was a technical assistant, and he led the effort to get comments from Shirley and from the other commissioners that were folded into that paper. So by the time it got up to the commission, it was not a surprise to them, and they made a few minor editorial changes to it and then issued it as that white paper in March of '99. That was their attempt to tell the staff we want to go this way, and I think send a signal to industry that they could start thinking this way too.
So
See, I got it.
Thanks,
a chat.
I think that's the kind of valuable background, that doesn't get recorded in things like the NRC history or, whatever may be produced of the work that went on during that period. So I really appreciate your insight into how things went. Coming to where things are now, one of the things that I'm trying to do for ANS is point out to people who write the standards that if they meet the criteria in the white paper, then they should be able to get endorsement from NRC a little bit easier than if they try to define performance-based in their own way, as a lot of people seem to be doing these days. You know, everybody would like to see certain things as part of how they define performance-based approaches. But anyway, this is really open to everybody else to ask your questions. And, you know, I appreciate Tom being available to answer them. So you can open up your mic, unmute your mic, and you know, pose your question if you want, or you can send them to the chat.
Yeah, we did get one chat that gave us the date for the final rulemaking package on emergency preparedness is due to the commission December 30th of this year. So if anybody's curious about the schedule, there it is.
Well, I don't see anybody asking questions, but since George Apostolakis is on the line, I'd like to specifically ask George if he has any reflections to offer on what Tom spoke about.
Yeah, Tom, can you say a few words about the issue of uncertainty? When you have performance criteria or objectives, I'm sure in the back of the staff's mind, they have the issue of uncertainty and how confident we are that we are meeting the performance objectives. So can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I think generally the regulatory limits like peak cladding temperature are fixed limits. They don't have an uncertainty associated with them. But in setting the performance goals, yes, you have to account for the uncertainty in what you're measuring and factor that into setting the goals. Now, I'm sure that was done under the reactor oversight program. I was not involved in that, but your point is a good one. You got to factor in uncertainty of what you're measuring, and then how much do you want to back off from the actual safety limit so that you account for those uncertainties, plus give yourself some time for corrective action before you get in trouble.
So what you're saying is that the performance objectives themselves include the uncertainties that the calculations will contain. For example, the subsidiary goal for core damage frequency of 10 to the minus 4, does that reflect the uncertainties in the calculation of the CDF at that time?
Yeah, it has to. We always use mean values and comparing it to the numbers, say in Reg Guide 1.174, but mean values reflect the uncertainties. Now, they may not be the upper bound on the uncertainty band, but they're a best estimate, well, sort of like a best estimate. Now,
What I'm saying is, suppose in a perfect world, our PRA calculations are acceptable by everyone and there are no significant uncertainties. Then it is conceivable that the core damage frequency goal could be 10 to the minus 3, but it's now 10 to the minus 4 to allow for this margin that you mentioned. That's how I'm thinking about this.
Yeah, I don't know if it would be a 10 to the minus 3. I think when that 10 to the minus 4 was set, I don't remember uncertainties being a big factor in that. It was more, how do you work backwards from the QHOs?
That's right.
And
But if you work backwards, you end up with a higher number than 10 to the minus 4. I think there were other considerations too, that core damage itself was something that was not desirable, so to speak.
yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Tom, there's a question from Steve Nesbitt. He says, going back to the definition of performance-based regulation, would you consider 10 CFR Part 50 Appendix K to be performance-based regulation? It has quantitative criteria, but it is also it also has a number of prescriptive criteria on how to do the calculation.
No, I would not consider that to be performance-based. That's the old way of doing business, where you had to calculate performance of the system, but it wasn't something you went out to the plant and measured. And there were a lot of things like Appendix K back in the old days. I will mention that in this licensing modernization project, it was an initiative by NEI and Southern Company. Getting back to George's question on uncertainties, they make decisions on risk significance of the various licensing basis events based on looking at the 95th percentile uncertainty. In other words, they don't use the mean value in the design basis accident region. They use the upper bound uncertainty value in deciding, does it meet the dose limit? Does it fall into the category of a risk significant event scenario? And they also use the 95th percentile on frequency too. So it's both frequency and dose they're looking at. And the NRC's accepted that in their reg guide.
Okay, Tom, I want to thank you. I guess people found what you presented to be, just enough, so they don't really have any questions. I want to thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge, on this subject. And, if people have any questions, please do send them to ANS, either Pat or myself. And, we'll try to keep the work of modernizing ANS standards going.